Welcome to this edition of Cup Chat with Birding with Texas A&M AgriLife Extension Service. Today we're excited to welcome Krista Demere, one of our favorite Texan Parks and Wildlife presenters on bats. She's going to join us for today's Beyond Birds episode, and we're going to dive into everything Texas bats. Enjoy!
All right, good morning, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us on Cup Chat this morning. We are going beyond birds today to talk about bats. So joining me is Krista Demere with Texas Parks and Wildlife Department. She is a wildlife diversity biologist, and I'm going to make sure we've got it. There we go, to where everybody can see both of us. Perfect. Before we get started, I'm trying to be better about not just jumping right in, because Emily's always really good about making sure we take time to get started, which, side note, Emily is at Stock Show. She's in Houston this week. So yes, she's been at a lot of stock shows. They've got Sheep Show this morning. She wanted me to be sure to tell everybody that Krista is her favorite. So now it has been recorded for forever, Krista, mainly because we get to do fun things with you, and you're a great educator. So, but I also wanted to talk about real quick our crane seminar. So if you missed that last Thursday, we had Up Close with Cranes and had 4 different great speakers joining us. Those were recorded, so hopefully if you were registered, you should have gotten an email with the link and the password. If you are still curious and would like to watch the recordings, you can still register. I'm actually, that link is not working right now on the website, but I'm going to get that set back up so that if you want to register, and then you'll get the password to view the recordings. So our next thing coming up that we announced a little bit during our crane seminar is Purple Martin Day. That's our next big thing, because we have Birding the Hill Country next, but that's of course already full. Purple Martin Day is going to be at the Llano River Field Station in Junction, Texas on July 11th. And it's going to be so much fun. Dr. Blake Grisham, who's the director out there, has got some really generous donation to study Purple Martins. And part of that is going to be sharing that with other people. It's going to be hands-on. We're going to be banding Purple Martins, so you'll get to see them up close and in hand, and that'll be super fun. So just a couple little notes for things coming up. But back to bats.
Super I will be there.
Oh, I should have said that part too. Krista will be at Purple Martin Day, which will be super fun, because there's actually going to be 2 parts to Purple Martin Day. There's going to be a main morning session. We're going to cap it at 40 people, so there will be a limit just because people will be hands-on banding stuff. And then that evening, we're going to do a fundraiser dinner, and super fun bonus, Krista is going to come and misnet some bats for us. So you have hands-on birds, and say hands-on bats. Krista will have hands-on bats. Not everybody gets to hold the bats, but you will put it. We do try to get everybody to get to have hands-on birds if you want to. So yeah, so we're super excited for that. It's going to be really, really fun. And the birds will not be the only hands-on thing. We're going to plant some native plants for you to take home, and just other really fun stuff. So all right. So yes. So back to bats though. Krista, first off, tell us a little bit about your role as a wildlife diversity biologist. I think a lot of people know, okay, parks and wildlife biologists, they work with deer, but deer is not what you do. So tell us about your role and how long you've been working with bats.
Yeah, well, I'll start off with a shout out to Emily. Emily, we miss you. Hope you're having fun at the stock show. But yeah, my name is Krista Demere. I'm the wildlife diversity biologist for Texas Parks and Wildlife out in West Texas, or what we refer to as the Trans-Pecos. And so I work within the wildlife division, and the wildlife division has a lot of different programs that target specific taxa. So we have our big game program, which a lot of people think of when they think of parks and wildlife, when that comes to hunting. Bighorn sheep, pronghorn, mule deer, white-tailed deer. But I am actually within the diversity program, which mainly focuses on non-game species. So typically I describe it as anything you don't need a hunting season for. I'm trying to wrangle in, work on management practices and conservation practices for those species. So that means I get to do fun things from our migratory birds all the way to bats. And even out here in West Texas, I get to work with bear and other cool critters like that. So being a diversity biologist is in fact very diverse. There's a lot of different things I get to cover.
That's cool. Yeah, it's funny because, deer in Texas is a big thing, but it's like if you think about all the species that are not hunted, that's a lot of species. So.
Well, and I mean, even as the non-game biologist, I grew up hunting, being a part of that world. And then the funds generated through our hunting avenues go towards our non-game species and those conservation efforts. So it's a big circle. I'm extremely proud to be a part of it and working towards conservation in Texas. And I love it. It's great.
Yeah, that's a good point. But your favorite thing is bats. Oh, yeah. So how long have you been working with bats? Because it goes from before you were a diversity biologist.
Yep. So let me take a sip here.
Oh my gosh.
I had a bat mug, but I got an otter. So I'm just
okay. But the first time you took a drink earlier, I thought I couldn't quite tell. It looked like maybe a landscape with something going on or like something abstract.
It's my otter mug.
Adorable.
Yeah.
Oh
I
my
wish I
goodness.
had that one. I would totally have brought it. But
that one's so cute.
Started with bats. I was an undergraduate student at Angela State University, and I was walking through the hall one day and I saw a flyer for the natural history of the bats course taught by Dr. Lauren Ammerman. And as an undergraduate, I was like, man, that sounds like some easy hours. It's a Maymester course, it's only 1 month, and you got a trip to Big Bend National Park. So it was a week of coursework in the actual classroom, and then we went out to Big Bend for an entire week and caught bats. And I just kind of had a knack for bat IDs from the very beginning. I thought it was awesome. It's a super fun experience. It's very hands-on. And we were helping her build her 20-year research data she had from Big Bend National Park. So after that, 2011, man, I just kind of hit the ground running. I did a lot of undergraduate research projects on bats through Angela State. And then I took several jobs throughout the West. I ended up working in Arizona on a bat project, looking at bats using burned snags. So that was really interesting. And then I went up to Wyoming and I did a lot of work in Wyoming with bats. And then after graduating, I actually went out to California and I did a statewide survey of Townsend's big-eared bat, which is the bat we used for the announcement for this talk. So it's a really cool species. And then I eventually got a master's working on the smallest bat we have here in North America, which is the canyon bat. And I did that project down in Big Bend. So I kind of returned home to my roots there. And I also spent time working for Texas A&M in the Natural Resource Institute. And so I did a statewide survey there doing bat work all across Texas, looking for white nose syndrome, and then also documenting where our bats are during the winter. So I've been in the bat world for 11 years now.
That's awesome. That's a lot of time with bats. That's very cool. I didn't realize you had been out west so much too. So that's fun. Very
and that's something that I think if there's any students on the chat that they should take full advantage of. Look at those internship opportunities, get out for a summer, go see different states, go work with different departments, different institutes. It was a rewarding experience in my opinion.
Yeah, that's a good point. And I would recommend the same thing as just going out. And we actually had a discussion with some friends about this at the Texas chapter of the Wildlife Society conference a couple of weeks ago. Is like, do you stay in one place to get more degrees? Do you move around? And we talked about how it's good to move around, but even if for some reason you're going to stay, like, because some people have some really good reasons to stay at one place, go do other stuff, like go do side projects everywhere, because it's really cool to see.
That's exactly what I did, because both of my degrees are from Angela State, but I did get the opportunity to go out and see different researchers, different projects, different areas. So don't be afraid to branch out. You'll enjoy it.
Yeah, that's good advice. All right. So we normally those of y'all who have watched us on Cup Chat for a while, you know that we try to make things, make our discussions be kind of seasonal. And so a lot of times when we talk about bats, people are like, bats, Halloween. But we timed this in asking you specifically to be in the spring. And so a lot of times we're thinking like spring, bird migration, but why is spring a good time to talk about bats, especially here in Texas?
Yeah, spring's a great time because just like birds, bats migrate. But unfortunately, we understand bat migration a lot less than what we understand bird migration to be. There's different research out there that suggests that instead of maybe migrating across the latitudes and going south, maybe bats actually migrate with the elevation gradients. So they could go from a higher elevation to a lower elevation during the winter, or even the opposite, depending on where there could be a roost or a hibernacula that meets the temperature requirements a bat needs to hibernate. But either way, bats are changing where they're at on the landscape. Here in Texas, we believe that a majority of the species actually leave the state. So Mexican freetails, which are famous during the summer, most of those guys will actually leave and head south towards Mexico for the winter. And it's this time of year that everything is coming back. So our bats are returning. They're actually starting to divide themselves right now. So there's going to be bachelor colonies where a whole bunch of dudes will go hang out. And then the ladies go to a maternity colony. Those sites are usually a lot warmer than you typically expect of a roost because when the pups are born, they need to be kept a comfortable, warmer temperature to help them in development. So we've got crops going in the ground during the spring. We've got bats returning. It's just a great time to see bats as they migrate through. So something that might not be here in July might be here in March. So it's really interesting to see the movement out on the landscape.
Yeah, and it's interesting to me because I think, at least as an undergraduate, when I first kind of learned about migrating bats, I was like, oh, Mexican free-tailed bats, they migrate. And like you said, most of them do, but here in Uvalde at the center, there's some that stay we hear them year round, like over by our storage area. So they stay put. But it's kind of just interesting to just as it shifts. There's certainly more of them here because we're just south of the Frio bat cave that had the second largest maternity colony in Texas. And so there's a bunch then because they're only there in the summer, but there's a handful that hang out, which is kind of interesting to me. So
yeah, and we do have some really unique bridge sites out here in West Texas, just northwest or northeast of Fort Davis, where they seem to stay all year. And that's kind of confusing to our bat researchers here in the state. So we believe they might be young bats that don't know where they're supposed to go. And so they're like, man, this is where I was born. I'm just going to hang out here for a winter. And the next year they may learn that, hey, it's a little warmer south of here. We should go that direction.
That's funny. And that's interesting that's something just that we're still learning about because the things that trigger migration and, like why an animal will migrate can be so different for different species that, some are really following what is just intrinsic. Some of them are like learning from others. And so that's really interesting to think about. One other thing about bat biology then, because you mentioned so they split up, we've got bachelor colonies and the maternity colonies. And the mothers will go and give birth to pups. How many pups does a typical bat have? I'm guessing it varies by species.
So it does vary by species, but a general rule of thumb is that they probably only have one pup per year. And unlike birds, if the first pup doesn't work out, there's not a round two. So with birds, if something happens with the first clutch and it's early enough in the season, then a pair may be able to try again. Well, because of bat biology, they get one shot a year basically to put an offspring out into the world. And so Mexican freetails typically only have one pup a year. There's really awesome videos showing how a mother finds her exact pup when she returns to the roost. If you haven't seen those, I suggest checking them out. They're pretty cool. But we do have several species here in West Texas that can have 2 pups a year. And actually the smallest bat in North America, which is the one I worked on, even though it's so tiny, it is capable of having 2 pups a year. And then some of our tree roosting species have 2 pups a year. So I don't know the driving factor between deciding who has 1 and who has 2, but I mean, it's pretty cool just to see the different variety.
Yeah, that's interesting. So when they have 2, are they having 2 at once, or do they have 1 and they have another?
They're having 2 at once. And a single pup, when it's born, can be almost 50% of the mother's body weight. So just think of trying to fly around and go do your errands and then go get some food, and like you're carrying 50% of your weight. So these ladies, by the time they get ready to have these pups, I always describe it to students when we take them out in the field and we're trying to determine if a bat's pregnant or not. I said, if it looks like she's got a Vienna sausage that's sideways, I mean, it's a pretty distinct little there, but that's kind of what I picture. I'm like, man, these ladies get hefty. They get hefty.
That's crazy. And especially for an animal that flies, like it's hard to walk when you're pregnant, and let alone think about flying with something. I mean, that'd be, the equivalent of 60, 70 pounds of a baby.
And that's probably why it's extremely rare to ever catch a female with a pup latched onto her while she's out foraging or anything. That doesn't happen a lot because, man, like I said, that thing's hefty. And so if you can leave him at home in the roost and then come back later, that's what you should do.
Yeah, like you stay. I'm not dragging you around with me.
I'm done with that.
I need some mom time off. I'm going to go run errands by myself.
Yeah.
That is crazy. I did not know that. Yeah, that's a big baby. How funny. We just also kind of bat biology note with birds. We talk about like being precocial or altricial. We've got like precocial, you got ducks, they're going to hatch and be like pretty ready to go, as opposed to altricial birds that are, completely featherless and helpless. Pretty much all bats that I'm guessing are on that precocial side. Like they're maybe not ready to fly right away, but they're at least like fully furred and ready to be by themselves for a little bit. Or are they not? Are they born without fur?
No, these guys, so a lot of rehabbers get calls when they find baby bats on the ground, and these things look pretty sad. They're naked. They don't look like they can do much on their own. And so it does take some development within that first month, but man, these things develop fast. And so they can go from this naked, really not able to take care of itself little animal to within a month, they can be ready for their first flights, and they can look almost the size as mom. So for my research project, I actually looked at the diet and how it varied across lactating females, pregnant females, and then also juveniles. And by the time the juveniles take flight, they're not quite as big as mom, but it's not that much of a difference. And there's subtle variation in telling juveniles from adults just a month and a half in. So they develop fast.
That's crazy. That's really interesting. One of the fun things, this is kind of a sneak peek if you didn't see the crane webinar, but one of the fun things that I learned from the webinar was that a juvenile whooping crane will grow like an inch a day. Like they're growing so fast. And so I think that's crazy when we think about how fast some of those animals are developing. So,
yeah, no, if a bat grew an inch a day, we should probably be scared. So I'm glad it's not that much.
That would be terrifying, but it sounds like it's still like for its size, it's kind of doing the equivalent of that, of just like developing so fast. Yeah, a giant bat would be super scary. So on that note, hey, it looks like Emily is joining us just to say hi from the stock show. So we'll see if we get her here in just a second. Hey, Em.
All right. Hey.
You got a sheep.
I just was calling in to say good morning to Krista since I can be there.
Good morning, Emily.
We have no rules, so I thought I would call in and completely interrupt everybody and say goodbye.
Well, we were on it. Chat. We were going on a different track anyhow, so you were just right. You were totally perfect. Bye. Okay, that was perfect. That was perfect though. So talking about giant bats and just things we don't know about bats. For a lot of people, bats are kind of scary or kind of unknown. Like obviously, I'm a biologist who knows, not that much about bats. But so, for just things that people don't know, there's a lot of myths out there. What are some things that you commonly hear people say about bats that you would like to dispel the myth?
You might have to remind me of some of the common ones, because once you get into the world, you tend to forget about what some of the myths are. But
that's true. So like standing outside, like sometimes I've seen them when you're flying around the campfire and they fly really low and people worry that they're going to like come for you or like get in your hair or like land on your head.
No, like bats and hair, that would be the last place they wanted to be, I promise. But there are things happening around a campfire in that situation that may draw insects into the campfire or insects around your camp just in general. Maybe you have a camp light on. And so the bat's actually using you as a tool out on the landscape. You and your campground might be attracting different types of moss into your camp light. And so he's actually trying to help you out. So while you're sitting there trying to prep dinner at night, you don't have a million bugs in your face. But if he ever swoops down, it's probably him trying to get an idea of what you are and where you're at, and then he's going to go about trying to find his own bug. Another thing that I hear a lot is that you're as blind as a bat, which is a terrible myth because bats actually have extremely good eyesight. And our Megachiroptera, if you've ever heard of a flying fox or seen footage of Australia and these big winged animals, they actually don't echolocate at all. And they have better eyesight than humans do. And that's probably because they're active right in the early morning when it's pretty hazy, and they're active in the evening when it's pretty hazy. And they're trying to find fruit in trees and things like that. So they have to have very keen eyesight to pick up that and forage. Then we've also got bats that eat frogs and things like that. And so they have to have really good eyesight to be able to pick out that frog within the mud along the creek. And so echolocation may help those guys, but it's the eyesight that actually helps draw them into those animals. So bats are extremely well-sighted and they're not blind at all. So he's not going to run into your hair because he can't see you.
That's very cool. I had no idea there were bats that didn't echolocate. So that's super cool.
I believe there's only one of the Megachiroptera species that can kind of do both, but he actually sends out clicks that are a little different from echolocating. So yeah, we've got bats that don't echolocate at all, but all of our ones we have here in Texas and North America do echolocate. So there are a lot of the insect foragers, which the echolocation helps bounce back and tell them where the bug is and how far away and things like that.
Yeah, that's really cool. So I got to go back to the campfire thing real quick because I love the idea of the bat is like using that as a tool and also helping you out. What it made me think of right away, in the movie Tangled, how Rapunzel has a little chameleon that stays with her. Sometimes when I've been out in the field and there's a lot of bugs, I'm like, I need like a personal chameleon to keep this area free of bugs. What I really need is just a bat friend. Like that'd be a pretty cool, like I got my friendly little bat to, keep the bugs away from me.
Yeah, no, so anytime you have those guys and they're hanging out with you, just say thank you and keep going about your daily camp chores.
Yeah, perfect. Going real quick off of the diet, you mentioned most of the species in Texas are eating insects. Can you break down for us a little bit? Because I think another myth comes in when people think bats and they think vampire bats. But can you break down what different bats eat and what most of the species? Well, you said most of the species in Texas eat bugs. What else do we find in Texas?
Yeah, so bats probably have the most diverse diet of any mammal that we have on the planet. They're kind of like birds in that way. You think of a bird and you've got everything from hummingbirds to seed eaters to raptors that are taking prey. Well, that's pretty much the same with bats. You've got things that can have elongated claws that can scoop water and actually eat fish. You've got things that are primary insectivores and they come out at night and they're eating the mollusks. You've also got species here in Texas that are nectar bats, and they actually pollinate our agave species, which is very good for the tequila industry down in Mexico. So if you like tequila, you should always think of bat. And there's also bat-friendly tequila, and I suggest that those are the ones you try and give your money to.
Yeah, I just learned about the whole bat-friendly tequila thing recently, because you can agave, I guess, is a succulent. You don't have to pollinate it to grow more because the plant produces little baby pups, but it can't, like, so the bat friendly ones, they let it let it grow to be pollinated before they make more. I'm not 100% sure how that works. I just learned about this recently.
So you have to castrate the plant in order to make tequila, which means that it doesn't actually come up and bloom in a stalk, which is what the bats need to go ahead and feed on that nectar and then pollinate more plants. And so bat-friendly tequila companies will actually let a certain number of their agave go ahead and bloom out, which helps the bat species, and then just also promotes good conservation. So we've got nectar feeders in Texas, and the big scary thing is anything that drinks blood, which would be our vampire bats. And so we've got 3 vampire bats in the entire world. 2 of them actually feed on the blood of birds pretty exclusively, and only 1 of them actually feeds on the blood of mammals. We do have a record of a vampire bat occurring in Texas, but it only has 1 occurrence record, and it was literally right on the Rio Grande in an abandoned railroad tunnel. So that's the only record we've had. We've never had any more records of vampire bats in the state. And that vampire bat that was found in Texas is actually one of the species that feeds pretty exclusively on the blood of birds. So they'll find a sleeping bird in a tree, and they'll actually land on the branch and just crawl over to the bird, and they'll nick the leg and drink some of the blood and then fly off, which is cool in a way. The bird never even knows he's there, and then he's gone.
It's kind of crazy. Just, while you sleep, like, you never even know that it happened. That's crazy. Okay, we got to go back to a term that you used real quick, because I had never thought about this term being used with plants. They castrate the agave plants. That's how you say it?
Yes.
I never thought about castrating a plant.
Yes.
Emily's going to be mad that she missed this part. I learned that's something else that I learned new today. So, all right. So I think some of that ties into like how bats are beneficial to our ecosystem. So they're, eating pests, they're pollinating crops. And we've got a bunch of different species, which is pretty cool. How many different species total are there in Texas?
So I actually hate that question because it depends on how you want to count. So I just said that we've had 1 record of a vampire bat in Texas. So do we count vampire bats, or do we say they actually don't occur here? Well, if you want to count every bat that's ever been found in Texas, we have 34 species of bats in Texas. Now, of course, like the vampire bat, we've got a few other species that have only been found once, twice, a couple times. And so we're not confident that those species are actually permanent residents of the state. And so the number could be more like 30, 29 that are actual permanent residents. And of those, 28 bats have been found in West Texas. So like with birders, if you're having a big year, if you were a bat person and having a big year, you'd want to come to West Texas to get all your bats in.
Yeah, you are like in the bat central, bat hotspot.
Yep. And so there's over 1,300 different bat species in the world. And so 34 might not sound like a lot, but Texas is actually the most diverse state we have in the continuous United States. So that's pretty cool.
That is pretty cool. That's very cool. It's neat just to think about that many different species. And it's a good point about how we decide how many species there are. Because same thing for birds, like right now there's a bat falcon that's been hanging out in the lower Rio Grande Valley for a while, but we wouldn't typically include a bat falcon on the list of Texas species. So that's another good point for the vampire bat situation, to think of the vampire bat sighting that was even more rare than our bat falcon, who's been hanging around for a week, which is also kind of fun to talk about bat falcon while we're talking about bats, because they eat bats. So that's pretty cool. Okay, so we're running out of time. I have so many questions for you, but when you talk about like a bird big year or a bat big year, bats are not totally different, like identification from birds, and that you're not going to see these different bright colors. They're not going to be out during the day. And something that I think some people don't realize is the different sounds they're making. Just like with birds, we can actually tell species apart with their sounds. So can you talk a little bit about like different sounds that bats make, and how you, like as a biologist, how do you figure out what species a bat is? Are you typically relying on sight because you're catching them? Do you ever use sounds for projects? How does that work?
Always having a bat in hand is going to be the most definitive way that you can get a species ID. Similar with the bird in hand is better than two in the bush. A bat in hand is better than two in the roost. But we do have tools that we can use, which are echolocation devices that pick up the ultrasonic sound that bats make. And because different bats forage on different insects, they actually produce different calls, depending on what insect they're primarily targeting, and then also the natural history of the bat. But unlike birds, where song and things were developed for interspecies communication, like a mockingbird is trying to attract other mockingbirds, or anything with a beautiful song is trying to sing to the female of that species. Well, bat echolocation didn't develop in that way. Bat echolocation actually developed as a tool to feed the bat. And so there is some overlap with different echolocation calls if the bats are targeting similar prey items. And so although scientists can use the echolocation call to determine what bat species is flying around, there are some overlaps, especially in species who eat similar insects. So it's rewarding and frustrating at the same time, especially if you know the species that overlap in echolocation calls can both be found where you're at. And you're like, oh man.
Yeah, so it's, in other words, it's challenging, just like with birding. Sometimes you're like, it's only making a chip note, like, and I can't see it, I don't know what it is.
Well, and bats do have social communication that humans can actually pick up on. They're pretty audible. It's usually within our hearing range. And so if you ever walk by a bridge site or a building where bats are roosting and you hear a lot of chipping, that's usually their social communication. They're talking to each other. They're telling each other where they're at. They're not actually searching for food or prey items, so they're not echolocating. It's the echolocation part that is usually above human hearing. There are 2 different species or 3 different species of bats here in Texas that echolocate at such a low frequency that we can actually hear.
So really?
Yeah. Pretty awesome.
That's cool. Which species?
So you have the spotted bat out here in West Texas, which drives me insane because I hear them flying around all the time and I have never got one to go in my net. So I feel like they're taunting me every time I have a net set up, and I can hear them flying around and I never get one. And then we also have the mastiff bat, which is the largest bat we have here in the United States. And you can picture a large bat, like a big whale who can send out echolocation that can be heard a long ways away. So they're using low frequency calls to go long distances, and that's why we can hear those calls. So this thing is like a big cargo plane or something going through the air. It wants to send a call out that can go far enough that he has time to maneuver around his obstacles. So
that's cool. Okay, well, next time I'm out in the Trans-Pecos, we're going to have to go listen to spotted bats, because I did not know that, and that's way super cool. And so just so birders can kind of relate, because there's birders that have that one species that you're like, I've been in its habitat so many times and I can't find it. So good to know that spotted bat. If you ever catch one, you've got to let us know so we can post and be like, Krista got her spotted bat.
Yay! I wish, I hope someday.
Well, before we wrap up, I feel like it would be remiss to not cover just a little bit of bat safety, because bats do sometimes roost in buildings. Sometimes you end up with them in places you don't want. What should somebody do if you find a bat, whether you're inside or outside?
Well, Life actually has a really good resource on the web about bat safety. It's specifically directed towards schools, but everything that they have mentioned on the website is what you should do in your home. So if you ever find a bat in your home, you should make sure that you put gloves on first. You never handle a bat without gloves on. And then you want to find a box or a container of something that you can put over the bat, and then maybe slide a piece of paper, cardboard under it, and then take that animal outside. If for any reason a bat is ever found in a room with a child who maybe can't communicate whether or not they touched the bat, or a pet that you may be concerned had interacted with the bat or may have touched the bat, it is always the safest protocol to have that animal collected and sent into the Department of State Health Service to be rabies tested. Rabies is actually less than 0.5% of the bat population, but it's always best to be safe instead of sorry. So we need to care about our people and our community. And so don't ever risk your health or the health of a loved one because you're scared of sending an animal in. Go ahead and send it in and get it tested. In general, it's extremely low that any of them would have rabies.
Mm-hmm. And I'll share that resource in the comments that Krista mentioned, but it's a good point. Rabies is an interesting and pretty scary disease, but it's one that if you get to the point, like you can't just wait and see like, oh, I'll see if I feel bad and then get treated. Because if you get to the point of symptoms, it's almost 100% fatal. Like I think less than 10 people have survived ever once you get to the point of having symptoms. But if you get it treated, it's like almost 100% success rate of getting treated. So that's why it's one of those things that like get the animal tested. Or sometimes if you're not sure if there was an exposure, like if you can't get the animal tested, for some reason, then you, sorry, I totally lost my train of thought. Then you may have treatment done anyhow, because it's a very serious disease. So
yeah. And so as a bat researcher, I have pre-exposure vaccinations, and then I get my titer checked every 2 years to make sure that my immune system is up to date and I have that protection against any type of exposure. So we try and keep on top of that. But if you don't have a pre-exposure vaccine, there is a post-exposure vaccine, which is what you were talking about. And that is always an option. Our drugs have developed more throughout the years. And so we're getting pretty good at providing a safe measure for anybody interested.
Yeah, the post-exposure is not as scary as it used to be. Like it's still a good number of shots and it's a series, but it's not like they used to be like the painful shots in your stomach and all that. It's not like that anymore. So that's good for people to know as well, is that like it's far less scary to go through that than to risk getting sick.
Right.
So
right.
I actually have the pre-exposure too. I was a research volunteer in Honduras as an undergraduate, and just being kind of in that area, possibly working with bats or possibly just exposure to other mammals. So that's a good reminder. I need to go get my titer checked.
Yeah, get your titer checked.
But all right, well, we have run long because this is a really fun subject. Thank you so much, Krista, for joining us today. And if you enjoyed this and enjoyed listening to Krista, be sure that you come join us for Purple Martin Day. Our goal is to get that registration up at the beginning of April. So that, because we know there will be a lot of interest in it, but we will definitely announce when that is put out there. So thank you again, and everybody have a great day.